A Syrian fighter jet has been shot down over Idlib province, and the pilot is dead. Turkey just fired a surface-to-air missile directly at a Syrian Arab Air Force aircraft operating inside Syrian airspace, brought it down in flames, and the regime in Damascus is calling it an act of war. This is not a minor border incident. This is not a warning shot across the bow. This is a NATO member state using advanced missile defense systems to destroy the combat aircraft of a sovereign nation. And the regional consequences of what just happened could reshape the entire balance of power across the Middle East. Welcome to Legal Lens USA. I am your host, David Reynolds. What you are about to hear will completely change how you understand the Syrian conflict, Turkey's role in regional destabilization, and why this single shootdown represents one of the most dangerous escalations in years. Before we go any further, if you are new here, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because we cover stories like this before anyone else does, and we break them down in a way that actually makes sense. The mainstream media will give you 30 seconds of footage and move on. We are going to spend the next 12 minutes explaining exactly what happened, what weapons were used, and why every military analyst in the region is now recalculating their assumptions about Turkish intentions and capabilities. High above the embattled province of Idlib, where the Syrian government has been conducting operations against entrenched opposition forces for years, the skies turned deadly in an instant. Idlib sits in northwestern Syria, pressed against the Turkish border, and it remains the last major stronghold of various armed groups that have fought against the Assad government since the beginning of the Syrian civil war more than a decade ago. The province has become a frozen conflict zone, a place where ceasefires collapse regularly, where Turkish observation posts dot the landscape, and where the Syrian Arab Air Force conducts routine sorties targeting what Damascus describes as terrorist positions. On this particular mission, a Syrian fighter jet, reportedly a Russian-made aircraft conducting operations against opposition targets, was flying what Syrian military sources describe as a standard combat patrol. The jet was operating inside Syrian sovereign airspace. There is no dispute about that fact. It was not over Turkey. It was not threatening Turkish territory. It was conducting operations against armed groups inside Syria's internationally recognized borders. Turkish forces, stationed along the border and operating sophisticated air defense systems that have been deployed throughout the region, tracked the aircraft as it maneuvered through the combat zone. Then, without warning, according to Syrian military officials, a Turkish surface-to-air missile streaked into the sky, locked onto the Syrian jet, and detonated. The aircraft was destroyed mid-flight. Witnesses on the ground reported seeing the explosion, the fireball, and the wreckage spiraling toward Earth. The pilot did not eject successfully, or did not survive the ejection sequence. Syrian state media quickly confirmed that the pilot had been killed, making this not just a material loss of military hardware, but a direct military casualty inflicted by Turkish forces on Syrian military personnel. The fortified Turkish air defense network along the Syrian border represents one of the most sophisticated integrated systems in the region. Turkey operates a layered defense architecture that includes Russian-made S-400 systems, which caused massive diplomatic tension with the United States and NATO when Ankara insisted on purchasing them despite American objections. Turkey also deploys domestically produced Hisar air defense systems and maintains older American-made Hawk batteries in certain sectors. These systems create overlapping coverage zones that extend well into Syrian airspace, giving Turkish forces the technical capability to engage targets dozens of kilometers beyond the actual border. The specific system used in this shootdown has not been officially confirmed by Turkish authorities, but the engagement profile suggests a medium-range surface-to-air missile fired from a position near the border. The weapon would have been guided by sophisticated radar systems capable of tracking multiple targets simultaneously, distinguishing between different aircraft types, and calculating intercept trajectories in real time. These are not primitive systems. These are advanced defensive networks integrated with command and control infrastructure that processes threat assessments and engagement decisions within seconds. For a Syrian fighter jet operating at combat altitude, the warning time between missile launch and impact would have been minimal. Modern surface-to-air missiles travel at supersonic speeds, often exceeding Mach 3 or Mach 4, depending on the system. That translates to roughly 1 kilometer per second. If the jet was operating 15 to 20 kilometers from the launch position, the pilot would have had perhaps 15 to 20 seconds from launch to impact. Aircraft defensive systems, including radar warning receivers and infrared countermeasures, can detect missile launches and attempt electronic jamming or flare deployment. But against a sophisticated guidance system with modern seekers, successful evasion requires not just detection, but immediate and aggressive maneuvering that may not have been possible given the tactical situation. The weapon that brought down this aircraft represents decades of air defense development concentrated into a single engagement lasting less than half a minute. Read that again. 30 seconds from detection to destruction. That is the reality of modern air combat in contested airspace where adversaries possess credible surface-to-air missile capabilities. The Syrian pilot, trained on Russian doctrine and flying Russian equipment, would have understood the threat environment. Syrian jets operating near the Turkish border have been operating under that threat for years. But understanding a threat and successfully evading it when the engagement comes are two entirely different challenges. According to Syrian government sources and statements broadcast through Syrian state television, the shootdown occurred during a legitimate military operation targeting armed opposition groups that Damascus categorizes as terrorist organizations. Syrian military officials emphasized that the aircraft was operating well inside Syrian airspace, conducting missions that fall under the sovereign right of any nation to defend its territory against armed insurgency. Syrian Foreign Ministry statements condemned the Turkish action as a flagrant violation of international law, an act of aggression against Syrian sovereignty, and a deliberate provocation designed to protect terrorist groups operating in Idlib province. But here is where the story takes a turn that mainstream Western media will not give you the full context on. Turkish officials immediately justified the shootdown by claiming the Syrian aircraft had violated Turkish airspace or had posed a threat to Turkish observation posts located inside Idlib province. Turkey maintains multiple military positions inside Syrian territory, positions that were established during various phases of Turkish military operations in northern Syria over the past several years. These positions exist without the consent of the Syrian government and represent what Damascus views as an illegal Turkish military occupation of Syrian sovereign territory. It was not a Syrian military officer who confirmed the strategic significance of this incident. It was a Turkish defense analyst, speaking to regional media, who acknowledged that this shootdown sends an unmistakable message about Turkey's willingness to enforce what Ankara considers its security perimeter, regardless of international boundaries or Syrian government objections. Hüseyin Bağcı, a prominent Turkish international relations professor, stated in an interview with Turkish media that the shootdown demonstrates Turkey's determination to protect its forces and its interests in Syria, and that Damascus should understand that Turkish air defense systems will engage any threats, regardless of where they originate. Let that sink in for a moment. A Turkish analyst, speaking in Turkish media, essentially confirming that Turkey will shoot down Syrian aircraft inside Syrian airspace if Ankara determines they pose a threat to Turkish positions that Damascus never authorized to be there in the first place. That is not border defense. That is the projection of military power into a neighboring sovereign state, backed by the willingness to destroy that state's military assets when they operate in their own country. And the fact that this admission comes from Turkish sources rather than Syrian accusations gives it a level of credibility that cannot be dismissed as propaganda. Drawing an analogy to make this clear, imagine if Mexico established military outposts inside Texas without American permission. And then, when the U.S. Air Force flew missions over Texas to address security threats, Mexican forces shot down American jets and justified it by saying the aircraft threatened Mexican positions. The international outcry would be deafening. The demand for immediate withdrawal and consequences would be absolute. But when Turkey does this to Syria, Western media coverage treats it as a complex regional dispute with legitimate arguments on both sides. What does this shootdown mean strategically? This is where the story goes from shocking to genuinely alarming. The incident represents a fundamental assertion by Turkey that it now possesses and will exercise the authority to control Syrian airspace in regions where Turkish forces operate, regardless of Syrian government objections. That is an extraordinary claim to military dominance. It means that Syrian pilots, flying missions against opposition forces in Idlib, must now calculate that their own national airspace has become a potential death zone if Turkish commanders decide their flight path poses a threat. The implications extend far beyond this single incident. Syria operates with Russian military support, including Russian air defense systems, Russian advisors, and Russian air power that has been decisive in allowing the Assad government to reclaim territory from opposition forces over the past several years. If Turkey can shoot down Syrian aircraft with impunity, it raises immediate questions about how Russia will respond. Will Moscow provide more advanced air defense systems to Syria that could threaten Turkish aircraft? Will Russian forces in Syria begin shadowing Syrian jets to provide protective coverage? Will there be retaliatory strikes against Turkish positions in Idlib? Each of these scenarios carries enormous escalation risk. Turkey is a NATO member state. Any Russian military action against Turkish forces, even in response to Turkish aggression against Syria, could theoretically trigger alliance obligations under Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which treats an attack on one member as an attack on all. Now, the reality is that NATO would almost certainly not invoke Article 5 for incidents arising from Turkey's own offensive operations inside Syria. But the legal and diplomatic complexity creates enormous room for miscalculation and unintended escalation. The shootdown also impacts the balance of power between Turkey and Iran, two regional powers that have cooperated at times on Syrian issues but also compete for influence. Iran has provided extensive military support to the Syrian government, including advisory personnel, militia forces, and weapons systems. Iranian-backed forces operate throughout Syria, including in areas near Idlib. If Turkish air defenses can freely engage Syrian aircraft, they can also threaten Iranian transport flights, logistics operations, and potentially even Iranian drones and aircraft operating in Syrian airspace. That shifts the regional military calculus in ways that Tehran will not ignore. For the United States, which maintains an uneasy relationship with Turkey despite the NATO alliance, this incident creates additional complications. Washington has opposed Turkey's military operations in northern Syria, particularly operations targeting Kurdish forces that were American partners in the fight against ISIS. The United States withdrew forces from northern Syria in 2019 ahead of a Turkish offensive, a decision that generated massive domestic political controversy. Now Turkey is demonstrating even more aggressive military posture by shooting down Syrian aircraft, and Washington must decide whether to condemn the action, remain silent, or tacitly support Turkish claims of self-defense. American military bases in Syria, including positions in the northeast, where U.S. forces continue operating alongside Kurdish partners, now exist in an environment where regional air defense systems are being actively employed against combat aircraft. While no American aircraft have been threatened by Turkish systems, the precedent of a NATO member using advanced missiles to destroy aircraft in Syrian airspace creates a template that could theoretically extend to other actors. What happens if Syrian or Russian air defenses shoot down a Turkish drone? Does Ankara claim that justifies further escalation? The potential for cascading retaliation increases with each incident. According to Turkish government statements released through official channels, the Syrian aircraft was engaged after repeatedly ignoring warnings and approaching Turkish observation posts in a manner deemed threatening by Turkish commanders. Turkish Defense Ministry sources, quoted in Turkish media, emphasized that Turkish forces followed proper engagement protocols, issued multiple warnings, and only fired when the threat assessment reached a level requiring defensive action. The Turkish narrative frames the shootdown as a measured response to Syrian aggression, rather than an offensive operation against Syrian sovereignty. Syrian officials reject this characterization entirely. Damascus maintains that the aircraft was conducting routine operations against terrorist targets, was never in Turkish airspace, and posed no threat to Turkish positions. Syrian military statements described the shootdown as a premeditated attack designed to provide air cover for opposition groups in Idlib, effectively making Turkey the air force for organizations that Syria categorizes as al-Qaeda affiliates and other extremist factions. The Syrian government has called for emergency UN Security Council meetings and demanded international condemnation of what Damascus describes as Turkish aggression. The conflicting narratives, Turkey claiming defensive action and Syria asserting sovereign rights, create an atmosphere of uncertainty that fuels regional anxiety. For many observers, the key issue is not whose version of the immediate tactical situation is correct, but rather the broader question of whether Turkey has now established a pattern of using military force to impose its will on Syrian territory. This is not the first time Turkish forces have engaged Syrian military assets. There have been previous clashes, previous shootdowns, previous artillery exchanges. But each incident moves the baseline further toward normalized military confrontation between a NATO member and a Russian-backed government. In the absence of independent verification of flight paths, communications records, and engagement timelines, the truth of the incident remains contested, but its significance is undeniable. Whether the Syrian jet truly threatened Turkish positions or was destroyed while conducting operations Turkey wanted to prevent, the result is the same. Turkey has demonstrated the capability and willingness to destroy Syrian military aircraft in Syrian airspace, and Damascus has limited options for response that would not risk even broader conflict. So where does this leave us? It leaves us at a moment in the Syrian conflict where the international dimensions have become more dangerous, more complex, and more prone to miscalculation than at any point in recent years. One shootdown, one dead pilot, one destroyed aircraft has fundamentally shifted the conversation about who controls Syrian airspace, what rules govern military operations near the Turkish border, and how regional powers will respond to increasingly aggressive Turkish military posture. A NATO member state is projecting military power into a sovereign nation, destroying that nation's military assets and facing minimal international pushback. Russian forces watch from bases in Syria, knowing that their allies' aircraft are being shot down by a country Moscow has complicated economic and energy relationships with. Iran observes that Turkish military operations threaten the corridor through which Iranian influence flows toward the Mediterranean. This is a story that is still developing, and Legal Lens USA will keep you updated as new information emerges. If this video helped you understand what is really happening in this conflict, please share it with someone who needs to see it, and drop a comment below. If you are watching this and you understand what this moment means for regional stability, for the balance of power in the Middle East, for every nation that has forces operating in Syria, then share this video right now. Click the like button. Help more people understand what is actually happening beyond the 30-second clips on mainstream news. Do you think Turkey's actions represent legitimate self-defense or aggressive violation of Syrian sovereignty? Let us know what you think, because this conversation matters and your perspective matters. This is what happens when regional powers decide that sovereignty can be violated with advanced weapon systems and limited consequences. The answers are not clear yet. The response from Russia, Iran, and other actors is not defined yet, but the question has been asked loudly in the explosion of a Syrian fighter jet over Idlib province. This community has some of the sharpest geopolitical minds on YouTube, and these comment sections have produced analysis that rivals what you hear from professional think tanks. What we are witnessing is a conflict where the rules are being rewritten in real time, where each military incident creates new precedents, and where the potential for wider escalation grows with every shootdown, every artillery exchange, every assertion of military dominance across international borders. The mainstream news cycle will not give this story the depth it deserves. That is why Legal Lens USA exists.